Thanks for joining us this week. We're talking about international planning today. So this is the show where we talk about legacy planning, estate planning, and planning for the future and for your assets and making sure you have things in place to protect your family and protect your belongings. My name is Glenn Wagstaff, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about international planning. One of the things that comes up fairly often is where people say that they have property in another country. And sometimes the question is, well, what do I do for my estate if I own property in another country? In the past, we've had these conversations about real estate property and the fact that you need to have documents in any country where you actually own real estate, because that's a fixed, tangible asset that can't be moved from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So you have to have documents that comply with that jurisdiction where your property is held. And then we always recommend that you work with, an attorney or legal counsel that understands international planning so that they can coordinate your U.S. domestic estate plan with your foreign documents and make sure that they're coordinating properly so you don't unintentionally get rid of one of them or invalidate one of the documents. Today we're going to talk about movable property, which is, personal property or property that is held, for example, in bank accounts, business interests. This kind of property is not necessarily fixed to one specific location. And because of that, there is the potential to subject it to another jurisdiction and the laws of another jurisdiction for purposes of your estate plan. So we had a situation where a client came to us and they said, we're born Chinese, citizens. We've immigrated to the United States, and they, have at this point permanent residency in the United States, but they still have bank accounts in China. So how do they make sure that those bank accounts are going to transfer properly as part of their estate, and to make sure that they're avoiding the need to go through a Chinese probate? So one of the things we talked about was obviously the ability to put beneficiary designations on the account. If we can put a U.S.-based trust as the beneficiary on the account, that might be an easy solution. The other option is to actually change the ownership of the account to the trust. And depending on, the jurisdiction and depending on the bank and so on, that may be fairly easy or it may be more difficult. In either case, the idea is that because it's movable property, whatever jurisdiction that, if you have a trust that's a foreign trust and owns the account, then it's now subject to the laws of the jurisdiction where the trust is. If you have a beneficiary designation and then it pays out to that entity or to that individual, now it's subject to the laws of the jurisdiction where that individual or that entity is located. And so because of that, we may be able to get by with a U.S.-based revocable living trust in order to address the transfer of that property and to put guidelines around it and everything else without having to do it in a document within that country. So this can be done with pretty much any tangible personal property. We can do that by assignment or by gifting it directly into the structure. It can also be done with accounts, money that's held in accounts or investments, and it can be done with business interests. And the trick with the business interests is, again, either changing the ownership of the business or changing where the business is actually registered. Those are the things that will determine the jurisdiction where the laws are going to control for those types of properties. So we had a situation where we were helping a business owner, and they own a business that does business internationally. It's actually registered in 3 different countries. And the ownership of that business is just him as an individual. We wanted to put the ownership of the business as his trust. That way, if something were to happen to him, his trustee would be able to continue managing the business. There was one of the jurisdictions where we were unable to do that because they didn't recognize the U.S. trust and we couldn't record it that way in that jurisdiction. So we had to leave it in his name. However, we were able to do documents for the business, corporate documents, that specify how the interest in the business would be transferred internally without having to, subject it to the estate within that jurisdiction anyway. And so, there's usually a way around if there's administrative issues along the way in being able to just change the ownership. But again, that's the importance of working with someone who's familiar with the international landscape and with, the countries that you're dealing with where you have your property. One of the things that we always make sure of when we help clients to do international planning of this type is that we have local counsel in the jurisdiction where the property is located so that they can weigh in on the proper method of making the transfers. And, it's important to make sure that you have competent legal counsel, but specific to the jurisdiction that you're actually trying to plan around. In this case, if we're planning in another country, we want to have somebody who can, do the international planning. But we also want to have local counsel that can look over and make sure that we're complying with the way things are done in that locality or in that specific country. So some countries are easy to deal with and, because of politics and everything else, some countries are very difficult to deal with. The countries that we find that there's embargoes or there's no treaties because the U.S. doesn't have good diplomatic relations with those countries, those are more difficult to do this type of planning with. However, it's even more important to do that kind of planning in those jurisdictions because it's very difficult to be able to resolve a probate or to get access to assets for those type of countries when you have somebody that's living in the United States. So again, I think, from an international planning perspective, making sure that you have the right documents in place, that they're coordinating properly. And if you do have tangible assets or movable assets that can be subjected to an international plan rather than local documents, those are all beneficial things that will put your estate, your family, and your loved ones in a strong position to be able to gather the value of those assets in the future. Now, one of the things I want to share, just as we're, kind of wrapping up, is there are assets that are not necessarily tied to a jurisdiction. So, for example, in today's world, a lot of our clients have cryptocurrency. And those crypto accounts are held in international exchanges. Those international exchanges may be tied to the laws of a certain country for how they're governed, but the accounts themselves are not tied to any specific country. They're just floating out there. And in order to make sure that they're protected, the law is not clear which jurisdiction would actually control in the case of a probate. So in those situations, it kind of becomes the first come, first serve sort of scenario. If the family opens a probate in one of the countries, they will try to exercise control or dominion over that specific asset. And the chances are that it will be granted, assuming that there's no other pending probate, no other pending court processes that would otherwise affect it. So it's important, if you do have these type of accounts, to choose which country, which laws, which jurisdiction is going to make the most sense for you, and make sure that you have a plan around that so that it will transfer properly. For all these types of digital accounts, especially crypto wallets, crypto accounts, complying with the actual platform's features and allowances for accounts to be transferred is very important, because if you can't access the account after somebody passes away, then you just can't get access to the value or the crypto or the money that's in there. We've seen situations, and I'm sure some of you have heard of these cases, where people have passed away. The only way to get access to their account was with their password or their secure, their secure link, and nobody else has that code. And so because nobody else has, their secure key, then they can't access the account. And we've seen situations where it's gone for years and nobody's been able to claim millions of dollars of assets because they don't have a method to be able to access it. And the platform itself doesn't have a method to allow for access of it. That's part of the advantages of having a decentralized system. And so one of the ways around that is making sure that you address those assets very specifically in your state to make sure that your secure key or whatever access that you need to provide for important people can be transferred as part of your estate. And you may not want to list that information in one place. So what we end up doing is building in kind of like a scavenger hunt inside of your estate plan to be able to get access to the full secure key or code or passwords or whatever. And that way it's not easily found by anybody, but your loved ones can find it, can piece it together, and can access the accounts if something were to happen to you. So those are a few things to consider. If you're looking to do international planning, make sure that you sit with somebody who understands the international estate planning or legal landscape, and so that you can get some strong advice on that front. We appreciate you joining us today, and hopefully this information was valuable. Make sure to subscribe or look for us wherever you get your podcasts. We have regular conversations about estate planning, legacy planning, protecting yourself and protecting your loved ones. And we've found that over time, a lot of these conversations are very valuable for very specific needs. So if you go back and listen to some of our previous recordings, we have very specific topics, and we touch on international planning on a regular basis. So you can go back and listen to some of our other episodes where we've talked about international planning and some of the options available to you for that type of planning. Thanks again for joining, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.